Hello, everyone, and welcome to Municipality, a podcast exploring the wonders of local government through discussions and special guests. It's Matthew, and I'm here today with Kylie to share an episode with you about advocating for policy issues and change at the local and state government levels. Joining us today, we have special guest Mina Leyba. Mina is the Legislative Affairs Manager for the City of Thousand Oaks. She developed the city's first legislative platform and is responsible for the city's advocacy efforts for federal, state, and local policy. She coordinates intergovernmental relations for the City Council and represents the city at various organizations, as well as the Chamber of Commerce Government Relations Committee. She prepares for and advises the City Council's participation in a variety of government-related organizations in the Southern California region. She also serves on a number of policy committees and volunteer boards, including several state league policy committees, the Caneo Las Virgenes Future Foundation, and the Ventura County Women's Political Council. Overall, Mina has over 22 years of local government experience. Thank you, Mina, for joining us today, and we're so glad that all of you could join us today as well for an episode on a brand new topic, Advocacy 101.
Thank you so much for having me. What a treat to be here to share my experiences as a legislative affairs manager, but also to share some insights that might help listeners decide if this is the right career track for them, as well as make a determination in which field or area to best pursue to fit their interests. So thank you again for having me, and I'm excited to be here with the both of you.
And we're so happy to have you as well, Mina. And you set me up perfectly for the first question we are hoping to talk about today, which is just to introduce our audience to the work that you personally do. Could you explain what your job duties are like as the Legislative Affairs Manager and what responsibilities you have?
So you've heard it all: legislative affairs, government relations, intergovernment relations, public affairs. On the private side, you may hear DC representative or the notorious lobbyist. So I think what comes to mind when you look and hear all of these titles is the word that Matthew used in his introduction of this topic. It's advocacy. That's really what it is. It's plain and simple. And I think when you look at the word advocacy, you look at it from the standpoint of who are you representing? What are the needs that you're representing? So it's important when you're in a position like this, you're oftentimes a staffer. You're not an elected official. So you will be responding to the needs and interests of that elected body. And that elected body can be the federal government. It could be a business organization. It could be a special interest such as unions. It could be the state government, for us, local government, school boards. Even you'll hear that there are lobbyists or representatives for things like local boards and commissions. So it's quite interesting, the genre of how many people have certain advocates or representatives support and represent their needs to different parts of government. So just as a primer, as you know, local government is the first form of government. We're a municipality, and municipalities have to answer, we're the lowest form on the food chain, so we have to answer to higher ups. So as you know, there's state government and there's federal government. When it comes to regional interests and needs, I see the lobbying there locally as kind of jockeying for either coming together and coalescing on a certain interest or issue, or perhaps trying to sway them to see what works best for us. But I think pure and simple, when you're working for an elected body, that elected body has representation to constituents. So oftentimes you think of what their product or what their service is. And for local government, it's pure and simple. It's land use planning, and as well as local government services, police, fire, wastewater, trash, libraries, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why we should be aware of that is I have gotten calls from members of the public I have been I've been put aside in meetings for constituents asking me about issues on the school board, or they'll ask me something about the jails or public health. And there was one candidate that ran for city council that was complaining to me at one of a public meeting, and he was complaining about welfare services, and you have to direct them to the right form of government that's actually doing that. So where we are is very much the bread and butter services, but what's unique about city government is we are the first form of government. We are the city hall around the corner from where you live. And oftentimes we're going to get the knock on the doors on so many different things. I have gotten emails asking that the city take a position to ban the creation of foie gras. I've had folks ask us to get involved in medical issues, and I have to always say we have to stay in our lane. Whatever services we provide, we stay in our lane. So with the kind of work that I do, we usually work off of a legislative platform, and that platform delineates what the special interests are of local government. And as I mentioned, it's purely services, how we are able to provide those services, and then land use planning for our region or our municipality. So I have a list of different areas that I focus on. And what I do is I compare that list of interests to the legislation being proposed at the state and federal level. And sometimes I will monitor what's happening on the regional level. And I will take a position on behalf of our mayor. And usually it's always the head of your elected body. And that mayor for our city, I actually have the go-ahead to rubber stamp based on our pre-approved legislative platform by our city council. So that gives me the opportunity to either make a call, send a letter, send an email, set up a meeting, or fly into either Sacramento or drive up to the county to participate at a hearing and advocate for a particular policy that's being developed or proposed and say, this is why or why not the city supports this, and we ask you to consider our position. So that's really it in a nutshell without having to go into too many details.
You know, that makes me think, well, first, like a lot of our listeners are really interested in advocacy and voicing their concerns. Some are activists, others, like Kylie and I, involved in local government. Are there any particular skills or best practices like you've utilized through your work to achieve kind of those legislative goals? And I'm almost thinking too, and I don't know how much in depth you can get on this, like what if an elected official that you're theoretically representing is pushing for something that would be problematic? Would you put your personal opinion into it to do what's in best interest of the city, or like how would you kind of navigate that?
You are both so perceptive, and I'm glad you led me on this pathway, because quite frankly, and I appreciate that ask, I think first and foremost, it's the typical things on a resume. Strong skills in written and oral communication is important. You have to write your arguments. You have to be able to provide a cohesive argument for why something is good or why something is not good. But I think in terms of that, looking at basic skills, you gotta be a people person. And I think the reason why I say that is it's about relationships. It's about getting you in the door to have that discussion. And sometimes you're reaching out to members that are not even in your region, and they're saying, why should I take a meeting with her? She's from Southern California. I represent Northern California. Or I'm from Texas. She's from California. What's the point? And I think the most important thing is to establish those relationships early. When you're doing this job, first and foremost, it's your delegation. Make sure you have contact with your delegation. Make sure you have relationships with the staff, because I'll tell you, the person answering the phone sometimes, and I've seen this, and this is a true story, the person answering the phone a few years later ends up becoming the district director. And and they're also the ones that will say, you know what, Mina, let me see if I can get you 10 minutes, or let me get you to a staffer. So it's always important to mix and mingle. It's always to be positive, no matter what news, whether negative or positive, you're delivering. So you have to be a people person, and you need to make those connections, because those connections later will lead you to future discussions on issues you're researching, and also issues that you need insight from. And I think those are the three most basic things: being a people person, written and oral skills, and being able to be nimble, because sometimes legislation, you have like 48 hours to react. Sometimes the bill is posted, you've got just a few hours to put something together and to respond. But looking at it from the terms of your personal, and I'm glad you asked that, I have seen in my career, and I've been doing legislation for probably about 15 years now, I think the most important to realize is no matter what side you're on, you have to stay neutral. Because there is one time when I started this discussion, most of my members, both state and federal, were on one side of the party. And then if you come in wearing your personal party hat, they kind of look at you and question, wait a second, is she in it? Is she going to sell me out? Is she going to misrepresent my ideas and issues? So I always tell everybody, for local government, especially state government, federal government, yeah, get into your party politics. But for local government, a street lamp as well as a sidewalk are not Republican, nor are they Democrat. So we have to remember that, as well as remember you are not the elected. So you're just basically discussing what the parameters are of their interests. So always stay neutral. That's the number one thing. And when it comes to an elected official, and I've worked for a number of elected officials, both still on the council and many retired. There are times where they're going to come up to you and say, I've got an issue. Can we send a letter on behalf of the city council? Now, there's no hard and fast rule to say that they can't independently send a letter as an elected official. But when they're representing a city and using city letterhead, there are always rules that state you have to bring this information up to the rest of the city council. So my way of breaking that issue is asking if I can take it to the city manager for discussion, and if it warrants, we decide to take it to the city council for further discussion to determine if this is a viable issue that should be addressed and should have our name behind it or for it, or against it, of course. So I think that is one way to get around it, but you're right. You're always going to have elected officials with their own personal positions and their own ideas of, or sometimes it's just what they think is appropriate, but don't want to go through the process of bringing it to their council colleagues. So always be neutral, always be there to be the arbiter and say, let's take this to the city council and let's have the group of you decide. So you're never in a position.
Definitely. So especially based on that answer, it sounds like you've had a lot of experience bringing up issues to the city manager, to the city council. Is there one particular issue or change that you've helped enact that sticks out as like the most rewarding issue you've achieved? And could you talk a little bit about that for our listeners?
Thank you for asking. I think a couple of things come to mind. One of the rewarding things is I heard through one of my colleagues in a different agency that the governor was setting aside some funding for the police departments. And it was specifically for cities that had their own police department. And when it comes to issues like that, I think for cities like Thousand Oaks, we contract with the Ventura County Sheriff's Department, but the misunderstanding about that is police departments, even in a contract situation, will still drive around in patrol cars with the name of the city on it. They will still have the same basic services, such as crime watch, such as drug abuse prevention with youth. They'll always have the same operations as a traditional police department that is within the framework of that city structure. So I thought to myself, well, why are cities that have their own police department, just because they fund it directly out of their general fund, why are cities that contract out not having the ability to get that money? So I reached out to our sheriff. I had a discussion with him. And in addition to having that discussion, I reached out to other cities that were contract cities. And I said, we need a piece of that money. That's not fair. Why are we entitled to the same amount of money? Our cities are all interested in public safety and also providing funding to our police departments, no matter whether we contract or have them in-house. So that discussion created this groundswell of a lobbying campaign. And I worked with the State Sheriff's Association and their lobbyists, and we came up with a letter. I sent it out to contract cities. And based on that discussion, and it's sad because you're not in front of it, you have to be resolved being behind it and not always being the face to be the hero behind it. But what came about was the governor was able to get a number of letters from contract cities. And with the backing of the State Sheriff's Association and their board of directors, as well as our former Sheriff Jeff Dean, we were able to get a carve out for contract cities. So that I thought was just exciting, because it was millions and millions of dollars that was coming to contract cities that if nobody stepped up to have that conversation and create that groundswell, I don't think our cities would have gotten that money. So I was proud to be behind it, albeit not in front of it. And people, I'm sure the governor, Jerry Brown, doesn't know who Mina Leyba is, but at least the State Sheriff's Association, the cities that got the money, as well as our former sheriff, knew I had something to do with it. So I was happy about that.
Thank you. And that sounds incredibly interesting. And maybe you kind of answered this next question, but what would you kind of identify as one of the biggest challenges you've had to face in your role?
Well, I think, Matthew, you and Kylie already asked, being put in the position of having to say no to either the public for certain interests, or I think the most daunting is your city council member, your direct boss. But I think the most challenging role in my position as a legislative affairs manager is that, unlike some of my colleagues, when you're in a general government role, you have to somewhat be a generalist in your knowledge of operations. Because in order to react to legislation, you've got to know at least the basics of what happens in each department. And that is difficult. And I have to tell you, the big hot spot right now in California is homeless and the lack of affordable housing. And I am learning on the fly oftentimes land use planning, environmental quality, or CEQA, and urban planning. I don't have that background. I'm a political science major, and it touches on that stuff, but not really gets into it. So you have to give yourself a break sometimes and use your resources. But it's difficult because you spend more time doing the study of it and research to answer or prepare an argument in a letter or prepare a meeting, compared to some of my colleagues. One of my colleagues is government relations, and when you're in this position, you'll have a lot of colleagues in different areas. But one of my colleagues does Edison work. She works for the electricity company. One works for the gas company. One does water. One does transportation. And what's nice about their areas is that it's a single subject. and you can focus and build on that. Whereas when you go with a general office like a county or city, you have a multitude of services and operations, and then the revolving interests. So like a friend of mine, he does police, and it's so easy to do public safety. It's very intuitive, but there are times when I'm sitting here going, how does that chemistry work when we use non-cut materials and flushable wipes? So you're learning about things on the fly, and I hate to say, and the best way to describe it, a shot glass full of that information. So that becomes tough, and trying to find that information. And that's when your analytical skills come in, doing the research, and then calling your colleagues from outside or inside your agency to get those answers. So sometimes having to know too much versus a specific area gets a little challenging.
And actually, kind of on that note, a question that I just kind of thought about was, absent of the city council, there's so many different boards, committees, commissions in cities. And like in the city of Madison, for example, I think there's 49 city committees. And I'm on the Public Safety Review Committee, and we have like multiple subcommittees, and we now have a budget work group committee. And just as a member of the public being on it, and as a student, it's been incredibly fascinating.
That's fabulous. I'm proud of you. That's a great start.
Thank you. And something that like I've been wondering on this committee is like, what is the role of maybe your position or city staff with the committees, and maybe how, because like, let's say a committee takes a position on something that could conflict with city council, just kind of, would you be able to tell our listeners just how all that kind of works?
So I believe in many ways, this is basic civics. Their cities, counties, even state organizations have the ability for civilians that are not doing government professionally to get involved. And that is either to be appointed to a commission or a body, or sometimes even elected to those bodies. And what it is as a role of a staffer is, again, to be a neutral arbiter, to explain to them that they are not the elected body, they are the advisory body on something. Sometimes that body will make a determination on something they think should happen, whether it's a project or a policy decision or a project decision. Oftentimes it's projects that take place and decisions being made taking place on a project that the city is doing. So what that role is as the staffer is to guide that discussion, to come up with that conclusion, whether it is, well, here's what they're working on now. How do we feel about it based on our constituent group? And I actually was the advisor to the Council on Aging. So we would look at policies from the standpoint of, how do they affect seniors? How will this affect, like if it's a transportation issue and there's an interest in raising the fees. So that would be an opportunity for them to say, well, if you create this change, this is how it's going to impact us and our way of living, and perhaps consider an option such as maybe reduced fees or discounted fees. So I'd say for commissions not to take their role more than just an advisor, because you're sometimes going to be in a position where your elected body's not going to be on the same wavelength as you, but that's okay because they were elected by residents. So you have done your job as analyzing what that is, whether, again, a project, policy, or any type of decision making, and where you stand based on who you represent in that commission. So I think that's important to note, because I've seen commissioners get really riled up and they're up in arms and want to talk to the mayor, and you have to kind of just bring them back down to the ground and say, you're there just as an advisor, and it's advisory, but as a council member, their decision making is discretionary, whether they agree with you or not. So not to take it personal, but to know that you've done your job by advising them to the best of your abilities on that subject matter.
Right. I think that's a really good point of clarification. And it does lead me into what we have as the last question for you today, Mina,
Okay.
which is there any advice you might have to young people who are interested in taking that advisor role that you spoke about and finding ways to advocate for the issues they care about in local and state government?
There are so many ways to get involved, and Matthew mentioned he's on a commission. You have every right, as long as you're a resident within that community, within that state, to apply for these positions. Oftentimes there's vetting involved, and that is one way to get involved. There's also opportunities. City councils will always publish an agenda. State governments will always post some of their bills. They will always post their bills, but some of their working groups and some of the interests that they have in mind. And you have the ability to weigh in as an individual, not as a professional. You can call, you can email. In fact, most elected officials have on their websites a portal where you can actually plug in your name. It's not formalized like sending a letter like it was in many ways before, but with the advent of technology, you can just put in and type in your comment. And you can even say, I'd like to meet with you on an issue of this is something that's valuable in our community. So you can always volunteer to get involved with that. And I think with the elections coming up, and with a number of movements that have taken place, the Black Lives Matter, the women's movement, also their subject matter interests such as Heal the Bay, such as environmental campaigns, such as funding for a particular medical issue. You can always find a way to get involved without it being a professional. If you are a professional, I think the most important thing is to look at what you're interested in. This came about accidentally for me, but it fit and I love it. I think it's great work. But there are so many different opportunities for different industries. So if you're looking at this from a professional standpoint, hey, I got a job listing. Do you know that Creative Artists Agency, or CAA? They're a talent agency or agents for all of the stars or the movie stars. They're looking for a lobbyist. Universities are looking for lobbyists. Hospitals are looking for a lobbyist. So if you're looking at this work, start out as getting experience and make your way, because the work is somewhat the same, but make your way to something that you have passion about, because if it's something you enjoy, it'll be something there for you long term. And who knows, you may end up in a higher office being an advocacy director for the federal government, for a major agency, for a major corporation. But I think the most important thing is you have a voice. There are opportunities, and you can just get involved in any way or form. So it's not a matter of doing this professionally. Everybody can get involved.
And I think that's a great place to end for today's interview. I hope that our audience is inspired to take one of the actions or maybe multiple of the actions that you suggested today, Mina. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great for me to virtually meet you today, and we definitely appreciate all of the perspectives that you shared with us in our community here. Thank you as well to our audience for joining us today as we learned about advocating for policy issues and changes that we care about in the state and local government areas. If you have any questions or responses to today's episode, please take a look at the description of this video to find our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter handles. And we're so happy that you joined us today and hope to see you again soon in our municipality.